Okay, so the next topic is Orizaba, the next Eiffel edition. So this is the Iron Palace in Orizaba, Mexico. And why is that relevant here? Anyone?
No.
Who constructed Gustav Eiffel? Yes. So we have a couple of new changes in this upcoming edition that I hope we can get out before the vacations. That's a pretty realistic goal, and I'll talk about those changes. First of all, we have what we discussed during the October summit, the Artifact Deployed event. I'll go into a little bit of detail about the background for this new event, but not too much. So originally, when we talked about deployment events in the issue for this, we had a more sort of heavy-handed model where you would define services, and maybe those services had HTTP endpoints, and you could deploy to a particular service, and it was a whole set of events. And you started a deployment, you finished a deployment, and all that. But during the summer, we figured that it was quite possibly an overcomplication, and that we'd start small and simple, and simply introduce a single event, artifact deployed, where we simply say that here is, that artifact over there, we deployed it in the environment over there, and that's that, and use existing events for everything. So let's take a little look at how it fits into the existing ecosystem of events. So artifact deployed mostly relies on links, has only a few fields for expressing human readable description and a URI that would contain additional information, whatever.
It's not updated. No, it's connection.
Yeah, it's not updated. Why is it losing Wi-Fi? But it tells.
No, it's
okay. Check with. Yeah, it's there. I don't know. Okay, let's try again.
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. Good. So artifact deployed links to the singular artifact that is being deployed. We talked about during the last summit whether it would be possible to link to multiple artifacts, because a deployment could contain multiple artifacts. But what we said then was that you can certainly deploy multiple artifacts. That's fine. But then you are deploying multiple artifacts. In other words, you would send multiple artifact deployed events, not a single artifact deployed linked to multiple artifacts. We also added another possibility of linking to an artifact, but this time with a configuration link, which would be to an artifact that describes the configuration used for the deployment. Typically, the deployment configuration will not be part of the artifact you're deploying. It could certainly be stored together with that artifact in the source code repository. That's totally fine. But you would most likely not have the deployment configuration as part of your Docker image, for example. That would be highly unusual. So that artifact, the configuration artifact, could be a source code commit, for example, that contains an Ansible playbook, or maybe a Helm chart, or just a shell script that performs a deployment. That's entirely up to you. And in this case, the artifact link is mandatory, configuration link is optional. You can also link to an environment that indicates really the target for your deployment. I was thinking last night whether this link maybe should be named target environment instead of just environment, to make it clear that it's the target environment of the deployment and not the environment in which the deployment took place. In other words, like the machine or the Docker image from which you ran the deployment script, for example. That's something we could maybe talk about later. The environment here could be a specific host name, or it could just be a symbolic name like prod or staging or something like that. That's up to you. We also use activities for tracking or sort of putting the deployment into a context, or if we want to expose logs from the deployment, we can use an activity wrapper around the deployment using the standard context link like this. Yeah, obviously you would have an activity started, activity finished, and so on as well here. In the discussions leading up to this, we talked about having deployment started or deployment triggered, started, finished, like we have our test cases. We opted for not doing that instead of mimicking how builds are typically modeled with activities, and then you, at the end, you send an artifact created if that was what you did. The drawback of this is that you can't, from an observer perspective, you can't track whether a deployment has started, just like you can't track the start of a build, for example. So that's a bit of a limitation. So we'll see if we have a need to do anything about it. And also, you could have confidence level modified could link to an artifact deployed to indicate that it's not just the artifact that we're expressing confidence of, it's also the deployment of said artifact. Any questions on this?
Did you mention something about identification of the artifact? Assuming that deployed artifact is sort of an instantiation of an artifact, which means it can be built multiple times. So hence the need for identification to distinguish the different instantiations.
So you're doing multiple deployments of the same artifact.
So that's what the emails.
Yeah, I suppose you could, in that case, send multiple artifact deployed that you maybe
distinguish between. You have an identity for each.
Aha. Okay.
You have an ID field or anything that would sort of identify this particular deployment compared to other deployment of the same artifact, for example?
No, we don't have that. We could, if necessary, add like a name attribute to the artifact deployed, maybe. Yeah. Unless you could, I mean, you could use a meta.id of the artifact deployed as well. That's, definitely unique. Or maybe, depending on why you're making multiple deployments, maybe if they are to different environments, maybe the correct solution is to use the environment defined to distinguish.
I can see that be a reason why we want to have multiple instances of an artifact they're running in the same environment, and also there the environment is also instantiation. So same environment instantiated with an artifact instantiated multiple times. You may have it for, let's say, scalable microservices, for example, that you want to have.
Yep.
And they will be perfectly equal except for the name, identity of sorts.
We did a lot of talking about that also, whether in the deployment event, whether we should attempt to model like gradual rollouts or canaries or things like that. We opted for not doing that and just saying that, if you have deployed one instance, then you send one artifact deployed. If you deploy another instance, you do another artifact deployed. But you're right, that it's probably reasonable to add like a name or some of the kind of ID attributes to the artifact deployed. Unless you add it to there is a description field that you could use.
But that would be more for human readable reasons.
That's true. I mean, it depends on how you want this ID used. If it's
just a thought, if you are doing an artifact deployed in the same environment multiple times, then it has to be a different configuration of the deployment. Right? You cannot use same configuration. For example, if I'm running, if I want to deploy the application name. So that means I have to change something in the configuration. to make sure that I can deploy two different deployments of same artifact.
It's based on a technology-specific limitation in Kubernetes. If you're not doing that, you may not have requirements to have different definitions of your configuration platform. You may have a configuration server that determines the difference between the different instances, and the so-called configuration here may be a static one, which is common for everyone. Even though Kubernetes is limit is not imposing that scheme, but it will not be technology specific yet. Should be.
But not just technology. So I have a cup here, and if I want to deploy same cup, either I have to replace it or I have to place it here. As soon as I place it here, difference in configuration. And if the configuration and everything is same, that means I'm replacing it.
Well, you're imposing that the configuration contains certain things that points towards environment.
Yeah.
What if it doesn't?
Then you cannot deploy actually.
Maybe we
But
should. It's a really good discussion,
Yeah,
but probably not something we have time for now. But it's. I mean, if
It needs to be refined.
yes, and that's why it's only 101. Speaking of maturity before lunch. So this is, since we felt that it felt somewhat preliminary, and we wanted to sort of grant ourselves some leeway to play around with this and experiment. So we introduced the concept of experimental event versions. In other words, free 1.0 versions. And this is the first time we're doing this. And the point of free 1.0 events is that we can make backwards incompatible changes at any time. And this would allow us to make significant changes in artifact deployed or any other experimental event in the future without creating too much trouble. It could still create problems for events that link to the artifact deployed event or any other experimental event. One of the consequences of this decision is that SDKs, for example, that currently use which is safe to do because you can only, within a major version, you can only add new attributes. So the struct for v3 would contain the attributes for the most recent version within the v3 series. However, for experimental events, you would need to have one version for every single version of the type, since you can remove fields or change the type of fields in every single version. So I'm just mentioning that as a consequence.
What about links when you do these experimental versions?
Pardon?
Links, how do you treat them now? Sort of, those links are defined in the meta part, so is that also being part of the those links are quantified, so it's the mandatory optional thing. I
mean, links, valid outbound links are not present in the schema itself, but we do include it when we version them. So that's a bit of a problem that we talk about, or potential problem, in that, for example, the subject link for confidence level modified. If we decide to rename artifact deployed to something else, we can't get rid of the subject link in confidence level modified without creating a new major version of that event.
Or if you want to change the environment linking for that target instead.
That we could do, because that's a property of the artifact deployed event, not environment defined. Yes. So it's a sort of the source event type that controls that. So it's only inbound links to the artifact deploy that's a potential problem. It's a pretty small thing, but the item under test link for test case triggered previously could only link to a composition defined. And this was inconsistent with confidence level modified and its subject link type, which could link also to source code changes and artifacts. And we thought this inconsistency was in itself a little bit bad, but also it's pretty inconvenient to have to link to a composition defined if you don't actually need a composition. You would just have to emit a composition that sort of serves no other purpose but to satisfy the schema requirement of test case triggered. So we simply expanded the possible target event types of the IoT link for test case triggered to also include SCC, SCS, and RTC. So minor change. And oh yes, this was the third and last one. We are planning to add a link type to activity triggered that indicates that a particular activity is re-triggering another existing activity. So in this case, you would have a source change that causes an activity, let's say a build. This build fails, so it's retried or restarted. Then it's pretty valuable to have some kind of re-triggered event type, link type that points to this one and indicates that this build is re-triggering this one, and sort of it inherits the cause from the parent event. Another option could be to have had the cause link, to repeat the cause link and have it go from the bottom activity up to the original source chain. But then we're sort of lying because the rebuild is not triggered by the source change itself. It's manually triggered, possibly by either by a human or an automatic system that retries the build. So we haven't settled on the name here, hence the question mark. But something like this is the last change that we're going to get into the protocol before we cut the Orizaba edition. Any final question? All right, thank you.